Hello there friends, Ian here. Over the last few weeks, we have been discussing extensively POV or perspective. This week we will continue this and talk about my personal favorite, which is third person limited. If you look at the perspectives on a scale, omniscient being on the left side and first person being on the right side of a scale, right in the middle sits third person limited. Third person limited, just like the other third persons, uses the pronouns he, she, they, and more. In this perspective, you have a camera on the character's shoulder while having access to their internal thoughts and feelings. This is arguably the most popular and widespread perspective you can choose from. Unlike first person or third person omniscient, where one is better for character driven and the other is better for plot driven stories, third person limited, it can be good for both character and plot driven stories. With that being said, let's get into it. Just like the previous videos, we're going to be taking a look at the pros and cons of writing third person limited. We're going to be talking then about some tips and tricks on how to write third person limited. I will be giving 3 examples from 3 different authors, and I will be giving you a writing exercise at the end to help get you started writing this perspective. So first, let's get into the pros and cons of third person limited. The first pro of third person limited is that it is more flexible than first person. With third person limited, you can do a bit more than you can with first person. In first person, your flexibility is kind of hindered because of all the things you have to consider and staying within 1 or 2 point of view characters. You can also control how close or far you are away from that character. You can get nearly as close as you can in third person that you can in first person, and this is what some people call deep point of view. But you can also be more distant, like third person omniscient. Just make sure you don't pass over that line from limited to omniscient. The next thing that's good about third person limited is the ability to easily switch point of view characters. Just like every other perspective, you're going to want to keep shifts of point of view to scene breaks, but more preferably chapter breaks, as it makes it easier to digest and makes it less hard on the reader to understand who's talking. Being easy to shift character point of views in your story makes third person limited probably one of, if not the best option if you're writing a multi-point of view story, unless you're looking for omniscience. And if that is the case, then write omniscient instead of limited. You're never stuck with one perspective until you're done writing the story. However, of course, as you're writing in a draft, don't be switching out. Stay in one, and if you figure out you want to change it later. Another thing that lends itself to third person limited is that this is more intimate than omniscient, but it could be nearly as close as first person can be. With omniscient, you don't really get to know characters that well or get to learn about their motivations or whatnot. Of course you can, it's just you don't feel as connected with the characters as you do with third person limited or first person. The intimacy scale can go very, very intimate to not very intimate, but still more intimate than third person omniscient would be. And this is because you are in that character's head, just like in first person, so you get to know all their thoughts and feelings and everything else. The next thing that's good for third person limited is that it makes it easier for you to hold suspense and uncertainty with the reader. With first person, you get to see everything that the character sees. However, it's kind of difficult to get suspense going because you can't really walk outside of what the character's viewpoint you're in sees or feels. Of course, that's still something you shouldn't do in third person limited since you're in that character's head again, but it makes it just a little bit easier to maintain that uncertainty and suspense. However, third person omniscient is much easier to hold suspense in as long as you don't lose it. Moving on to the cons of third person limited. The first con you have for writing third person limited is that it is a more limited scope than omniscient point of view. Omniscient, you see everything, you know everything, it's all there for you. However, just like first person, third person you are, as I said before, in that character's head, but you're also not having the story told to you by the character, so it's not exactly the same limiting factor. The limited scope is not nearly as bad with third person limited, but it's still there. So you have to be aware of that when you're trying to decide on if you want to use this perspective or not. The next con is risk of weak character voice. Since you're not being told the story through the character, or you don't know everything like you do with omniscient, your character voice has a chance to be weak, which is something you need to thoroughly avoid in all of your writing. While thinking and coming up with the points of this video, I came across an article that said third person limited voice is always weak. But that is simply not the case. Just like any perspective, you have the risk of a weak character voice. But if you form that character voice and make it unique and strong, you won't have that issue. However, you do have to be careful with this. You don't want to have your character voice be bad, but it's not always bad, and it's not necessarily hard to come up with that character's unique voice. The next bad thing about third person limited is that there is a small risk, but the risk is there, to slip from limited to omniscient point of view. This is still something you have to watch out for, as this stuff does come up at some points. You might be writing one day in third person limited, and then suddenly you go from only knowing what one character sees and feels, you start talking about how another character feels. Like, say you have two characters, John and Mary. If you're in John's perspective, you want to be talking about only what John feels and what John sees. If you start talking about the feelings of Mary, then you've slipped into third person omniscient, and that is something you shouldn't be doing when writing third person limited. The final weakness of third person limited is that it is less intimate than first person. Now, since third person limited is in the middle of third person omniscient and first person, you do get a lot of overlap between what's good and bad with both of them. We already talked about how it's more intimate than third omniscient. However, it's also less intimate than first person for reasons I stated in that discussion part earlier. Again, if you want the most intimate writing and reading experience, first person is that. Next, we're going to move on to some tips on how to write and how not to write third person limited. The first thing you should do is to be consistent. Just like every other perspective, you have to be consistent with your point of view and other things like it. Make sure you have things set fast and early in your story so people don't get confused when something inconsistent with what you've been doing happens. You have to be able to set everything within the first 5 chapters for the remainder of the story. And once you set these standards for your story, you want to stick with it and be consistent for the entirety of the narrative. You're also going to want only what the character knows, as I've stated previously. You want to stay in one character's head at a time. But since we've already gone over this, I'm not going to go too deep into it because I'd just be repeating myself. The next thing you're going to want to do is to choose your point of view character with a purpose. You don't want to just put a character point of view in the story for the heck of it. it might not make sense to even be in the story. The point of view character should be the one with the most stakes in that scene or chapter. Or if your characters are separated for some time, like mine are for the majority of my trilogy I'm currently writing, then you might be able to transition from one character being in one place to having the next character you change to having the most important part of what you need to tell come up, and that would be when you would choose that next point of view. Even without that, there needs to be a reason for your character to have the point of view. If there is no reason, cut that perspective. Cut it out and don't look back at it. It's not something that you'll need or really make sense within the story, if you get what I mean. We've gone into the don'ts for 2 previous perspectives. And if you've watched those previous 2 videos, at this point you'll know what the first thing you shouldn't do is, and that is head hopping. Head hopping, just like in the previous ones, can be very jarring to readers and can make it very confusing to know where they are in the story or what's exactly happening. To prevent head hopping, all you have to do is switch character point of views on a scene by scene or chapter by chapter basis, and that completely negates the problem of head hopping becoming an issue. The next thing you shouldn't do is add too many point of view characters. Now, you might be thinking that books like Game of Thrones have 6 or more character point of views to go into, but a problem I and many other people notice when you start adding more and more and more point of view characters is that everything can get jumbled up. You might not be able to get a character's story fleshed out as much. So if you're going to go for more characters, make sure you know what you're doing. Make a longer book or series, or limit yourself to 6 or less point of view characters. I recommend around 4 or 5 because that's what I'm comfortable with, but if you're comfortable with more or less, by all means, do what you like to do, right? The last thing you shouldn't do when writing third person limited is to let the narrator interject. Now, the narrator can interject in third person omniscient. That's fine. That fits the perspective you're writing in. However, it does not fit third person limited. Under no circumstances, unless you're breaking the rules, but you need to know the rules before you break them generally, just don't let the narrator interject at all. You want to stay with the character that's going on. You don't want to get confused with the narrator or the character because that's just not something you do in third person limited. So just in my general opinion, do not go and let the narrator interject into the story themselves. And before we get into the writing exercise I have at the end of the video, we're going to, again, like previously, be giving 3 examples of 3 different books and authors. Third person limited is very highly regarded in fantasy, especially high fantasy and sci-fi and all these other things like that. So in general, third person limited is more used for multi-point of view stories that are filled with huge amounts of lore and character building and world building. That's what third person limited has its biggest strengths at. Let's get into the first example, which is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Bran tore his eyes away from the monster. That was when he noticed the bundle in Rob's arms. He gave a cry of delight and moved closer. The pup was a tiny ball of gray-black fur, its eyes still closed. It nuzzled blindly against Rob's chest as he cradled it, searching for milk among his leathers, making a sad little whimpery sound. Bran reached out hesitantly. So here, it's not as close as you can get with first person, obviously, and we're using Bran's name. We're using he, we're using his, all these pronouns that don't fit in first person, yet we get to see into the mind of Bran just a little bit, unlike with omniscient, or you wouldn't be able to see nearly as well inside their head. The next example I have is from The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Oh look, another fantasy epic. Fantasy epics use almost exclusively third-person limited at this point in history. The men around Sen shuffled, excited. The sounds were repeated through the vast army, the stillness giving way before eagerness. Hundreds of feet shuffling, shields slapping, clasps clanging. Kaladin remained motionless, staring down the other army. Here you don't really get to see inside the head of the character. However, you get to see from the eyes of that character what they hear and what they see around them. The next example I have is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Kaz dispatched 2 of them to keep an eye on Big Bull and to make sure that if he made it to his feet, he left the city. The rest could remove to the Slat and the Crow Club to drink off their worry, make some trouble, and spread word of the night's events. They'd tell what they'd seen, embroider the rest, and with every retelling, Dirty Hands would get crazier and more ruthless. But Kaz had business to attend to, and his first stop would be Fifth Harbor. This snippet from Six of Crows might seem like it's dipping into omniscient point of view because it's talking about what others might end up doing, but what it's actually showing, in my opinion, is that it's showing what Kaz knows will happen, because this is in Kaz's perspective, so you see everything from Kaz. And I think it shows what Kaz knows is going to happen compared to what an omniscient narrator might know about everything. The writing exercises I've been giving you have been relatively simple, and this is no different. The exercise you can do to help you start writing in third person limited is to just write a 500-word flash fiction in third person limited. Like, make a character or 2, switch between them once if you want to, but write a short 500-word story in third person limited, and that'll get you started. And if you think you're not up to the task of third person limited, this can help you build your confidence in what you're writing. And that's it. That's all you need to know about starting in writing third person limited. This will unfortunately be the last video in this series for now, as I don't know nearly enough in second person or third person objective to really make a video on them. And even if I did, I don't think I'd end up making a video on third person objective, since it is what movies use, and I don't write movies. Third person limited, as I said earlier, is the middle ground between third person omniscient and first person. It will remain arguably the most popular and widespread perspective for many, many years to come. Comment below what you like best about third person limited and how I can improve these videos for you in the future. I hope you enjoyed and found this video helpful. If you did, be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already, as I post videos like this every Sunday. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next week. Bye!